По отношению к российской миссии, только что, буквально час назад, нас информировали о том, что из российской миссии высылаются 12 ее сотрудников. Это очередное грубое нарушение страной пребывания соглашения с ООН об отношениях со страной пребывания, Венской конвенции и чего только нет. Мы давно говорили о необходимости начать процедуру арбитража о выполнении страной пребывания своих обязанностей по поддержанию нормального функционирования миссии ПАСПРЕС при Организации Объединенных Наций. К сожалению, этот арбитраж до сих пор так и не начат. Нам постоянно говорят о необходимости дипломатии, дипломатических решений и одновременно ограничить наши возможности для осуществления такой деятельности. Мы глубоко с сожалением о принятом решении и будем смотреть, как будут дальше развиваться события в контексте принятия этого решения. Сейчас у нас неофициальное заседание, но я вижу, что слово запросил представитель Соединенных Штатов.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to take a quick minute. The status of the 12 diplomats you refer to, I don't think is really the proper subject for this meeting, especially given the gravity of what we're here to discuss, which is untold humanitarian suffering in the country of Ukraine. But since you have raised the issue, I will just ensure my colleagues that the step that the United States government informed the Russian mission of today was taken in full accordance with the headquarters agreement that we signed with the UN, and that those diplomats that have been asked to leave the United States were engaged in activities that were not in accordance with their responsibilities and obligations as diplomats. So under Section 13B of the headquarters agreement, they have been given a request to depart this country so they do not harm the national security of the host country. And I look forward to taking the issue up, Mr. President, where it properly belongs, which is the host country committee. Thank you very much.
Сейчас действительно заседание посвящено не этому вопросу, но у нас есть свое мнение по этому поводу, и объяснение, которое дал сейчас представитель Соединенных Штатов, нас не удовлетворяет. 8983 заседание Совета Безопасности объявляется открытым. Предварительная повестка дня данного заседания гласит: письмо постоянного представителя Украины при Организации Объединенных Наций от 28 февраля 2014 года на имя председателя Совета Безопасности. С. 2014-136. Повестка дня утверждается. На основании правила 37 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителя Украины. Решение принимается. На основании правила 39 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании следующих докладчиков: господина Мартина Гриффитса, заместителя генерального секретаря по гуманитарным вопросам и координатора чрезвычайной помощи, и господина Филиппа Гранди, Верховного комиссара Организации Объединенных Наций по делам беженцев. Решение принимается. Сейчас Совет Безопасности приступит к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. И я предоставляю слово господину Мартину Гриффитсу.
Mr. President, I speak to you from Geneva, and wherever you are in the world, we have all been watching the military offensive in Ukraine with a sense of disbelief and horror. As we all feared, civilians are already paying the price. The scale of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, even in these very early days, is alarming. Humanitarian needs are growing at an alarming pace in the hardest hit areas. Civilian children, women, and men have been injured and killed. Homes have been damaged and sometimes destroyed. As of yesterday, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 406 civilian casualties, including at least 102 dead in these few days. The real figure could be considerably higher, as many reported casualties have yet to be confirmed. We know, and we will hear, of course, much more from Filippo, that at least 160,000 people have been internally displaced across Ukraine, fleeing for safety. We know that figure is likely to be much higher, potentially a significant proportion of the entire population. And of course, as Filippo will tell you, we believe more than 500,000 refugees have been forced to choose to flee their country in search of safety. So families are separated. The elderly and people with disabilities find themselves trapped and unable to flee, not even able to get that small comfort. The picture is grim and could get worse still. Aerial attacks and fighting in urban areas are damaging critical civilian facilities and disrupting essential services such as health, electricity, water and sanitation, which effectively leaves civilians without the basics for day-to-day life. Bridges and roads have been destroyed, cutting off people's access to critical supplies and services. The use of explosive weapons in urban areas carries a high risk of indiscriminate impact. This is of particular concern in places like Kiev and Kharkiv. Civilians will undeservedly suffer the most from these attacks on densely populated urban centers. It follows. All parties must respect international humanitarian law, take constant care to spare all civilians and civilian objects from harm throughout their military operations. A party should also, of course, avoid the use of wide area explosive weapons in populated areas. And the longer this goes on, the greater the cost will be for civilians. Children will miss school and face a greater risk of physical harm, displacement, and unimaginably severe emotional stress. Women, so often disproportionately affected by conflict, as we have so often discussed in this chamber, will be at even greater risk of gender-based violence, and women and children may be exposed to other forms of exploitation. The economy of Ukraine could implode, which will further exacerbate humanitarian needs and create a ripple effect that travels far beyond Ukraine's borders. Already the upheavals in recent days are deepening a pre-existing humanitarian crisis. 8 grueling years of conflict in eastern Ukraine had already left 3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance on both sides of the contact line in the Donbass region. And it goes without saying that humanitarian needs are now much greater, including the large-scale displacement to which I've already referred, across and beyond the entire country, and not only in one region thereof. Humanitarian workers are doing their best to respond. The UN has expanded its humanitarian presence in Ukraine. We shall continue to do so. We're working to ensure we can scale up our operations as quickly as possible, and we had been preparing for this for some time. I must say that for the last 3 days, however, our movements, the movements of our dear colleagues in Ukraine, have been seriously constrained as a result of ongoing fighting and our inability to receive assurances from the parties to the conflict that humanitarian movements will be protected. And only this evening, I was fortunate to receive the beginning of some assurances to that effect. We must hope that comes into reality. In the meantime, local organizations and institutions are doing, as usual, the truly remarkable job that they do in all such situations, responding to needs. Local NGOs and the Ukrainian Red Cross, are working tirelessly to support civilians and evacuation operations. Health workers working day and night to care for the injured, aid organizations providing psychosocial support to traumatized children, delivering first aid kits. And we're all here this evening, this afternoon, to support their efforts. Today, our most pressing humanitarian needs are for emergency medical services, including sexual and reproductive health services, critical medicine, health supplies and equipment, safe water for drinking and hygiene, shelter and protection for the displaced. In all, 119 organizations, partners, humanitarian organizations, are operating in Ukraine, able to provide some form of humanitarian assistance, though clearly stilted in these particular days. Right now, we urgently need progress on two fronts if we want to reach more people with aid that they need, that they deserve. First, we need the assurances from parties to the conflict that humanitarian workers and movements will be protected even during the most severe days of the conflict and not waiting for the conflict to subside. Even now, even today, even yesterday, we need to provide those protections to those workers to do the job that they want to do. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure the freedom of movement of humanitarians, a point we have been making in many different ways in these past 4 days. Secondly, of course, we desperately need more resources. Tomorrow, the Secretary General will launch a humanitarian appeal for this crisis with two components: a 3-month flash appeal for the situation inside the country and a regional response plan for the situation outside under the leadership of Filippo Grandi and his office. The Secretary General, alongside Filippo, our NGO colleagues, and I, will all call on member states to show support with quick, generous, and flexible funding. And cash will be a major source of delivery of humanitarian assistance in the particular circumstances that obtain in Ukraine. But this is certainly not enough. The lives of millions of civilians are simply at stake. We know from other recent conflicts how brutal, deadly, and protracted urban warfare can be. We know how countries' economies can be devastated, infrastructure, investment, and development gains set back an entire generation. And we know enough to know that we do not yet know what it will be the consequences of the events that we observe today. These things should never happen in any country, anywhere. Every effort, of course, must be made to de-escalate the conflict. The hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have taken the decision to leave their homes to seek safety elsewhere in their country or beyond, and those, even more of them, who remain at peril for the loss of basic services, of pensions, of support, of the services their children need, of the safety of a day that may come and may not. I reiterate finally, Mr. President, the Secretary General's call for the only thing that we must all pray for, an immediate cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Я благодарю господина Гриффита за его выступление. Сейчас предоставляю слово господину Филиппо Гранди.
Андрей.
Mr. President, greetings from Geneva. Today and in recent days, you have heard that the United Nations humanitarian organizations, together with their NGO partners, have remained in Ukraine. Let me start by saying how proud I am that we decided to do so, just like we did in Afghanistan a few months ago. But naturally, as we just heard, our colleagues on the ground, like the rest of the civilian population, are now caught up in this deadly conflict. Many of them were relocated, and military attacks might force them to move again. Yet, they're still striving to deliver help to people in need whenever a small window of relative security allows for humanitarian aid to be distributed, working with partners, including especially national NGOs, often in extremely dangerous circumstances. But we know that we're not even scratching the surface to meet the needs of Ukrainians, including an unknown but surely very substantial number who have been forced to flee their homes over the past days. The situation is moving so quickly, and the levels of risk are so high by now that it is impossible for humanitarians to distribute systematically the help that Ukrainians desperately need. I therefore echo as well the urgent call made by the Secretary General and just a few minutes ago by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and by others indeed. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected and spared, and humanitarian access must be granted for those delivering aid to those impacted by war. A failure to do so will compound the already extraordinary levels of human suffering. Mr. President, in addition to the grave situation inside Ukraine, and as Martin just told us, hundreds of thousands are seeking refuge in neighboring countries. They need safety and protection, first and foremost, but also shelter, food, hygiene, and other support, and they need it urgently. As we speak, there are 520,000 refugees from Ukraine in neighboring countries. This figure has been rising exponentially, hour after hour, literally, since Thursday. I have worked in refugee crisis for almost 40 years, and I have rarely seen such an incredibly fast rising exodus of people. The largest, surely, within Europe since the Balkan Wars. Over 280,000 have fled to Poland. Another 94,000 to Hungary. Nearly 40,000 are currently in Moldova, 34,000 in Romania, 30,000 in Slovakia, tens of thousands in other European countries. We're also aware that a sizable number have gone to the Russian Federation. I want to commend the governments of receiving countries for allowing refugees access to their territory. The challenge to admit and register, to meet the needs and ensure the protection of those fleeing are daunting. But so far they have been met, though I am seriously concerned about the likely and further escalation in the number of arrivals. Mr. President, we may have just seen the beginning. So my message today is one of gratitude to the governments of Ukraine's neighbors, and also through them, my heartfelt thanks to the citizens of those countries, ordinary Poles, Hungarians, Moldovans, Romanians, Slovaks, and citizens of other European countries have undertaken extraordinary acts of humanity and kindness. This is the humanitarian instinct that is so needed in times of crisis. I encourage governments to continue to maintain access to territory for all those fleeing. Ukrainians, of course, but also third country nationals living in Ukraine, people there to work and to study, and in some cases, people that are in Ukraine as refugees, and all of whom are now similarly forced to escape the violence. At this critical juncture, there can be no discrimination against any person or any group. I'm aware that the European Union, its member states, and other governments have already provided countries receiving refugees from Ukraine with bilateral support, which I hope will continue. UNHCR, with its United Nations partner agencies and national and international NGOs, is present in all these countries, and we are scaling up. We encourage host countries to avail themselves of our support and expert advice as they address the situation and uphold their international obligations. We're helping and can do more in areas like protection and registration, organizing reception capacity, providing emergency relief and cash assistance, and in identifying and responding to the needs of the most vulnerable, many of them women and children, including a growing number of unaccompanied and separated children. Mr. President, I regret to say that unless there is, as Martin said, an immediate halt to conflict, Ukrainians will simply continue to flee. We're currently planning, I repeat, planning, for up to 4 million refugees in the coming days and weeks. Such a rapid increase would be a huge burden for receiving states and would no doubt stress reception systems and related resources. Like all countries hosting refugees around the world, they cannot be left alone to shoulder this responsibility. I therefore welcome the support expressed by many European states at yesterday's European Union Justice and Home Affairs Council to activate the Temporary Protection Directive for people fleeing Ukraine. This would enable, if activated, immediate and temporary refuge in the European Union. It would also facilitate the sharing of responsibility for people fleeing Ukraine among European states. As Martin mentioned, we will launch the UN Humanitarian Appeal for Ukraine tomorrow for activities both inside and outside the country. Private citizens and companies from around the world have already offered extraordinary financial support through thousands of donations, over $40 million to UNHCR alone in a couple of days. And I'm counting on governments to do the same, and quickly. Ukrainians and countries hosting refugees from Ukraine cannot wait. Finally, Mr. President, a reminder that Ukrainian refugees, like all others, and please let us not forget the continuing plight of Afghans, of Syrians, of Ethiopians, of the Rohingya people from Myanmar, and of many others. All of them never wanted to be refugees. They never wanted to be forced to flee their homes, and they all hope to return to their country as quickly as possible. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, it is not very often that I get to brief the Security Council. Let me take this opportunity, therefore, to echo what I said to the Council the last time you invited me a few months ago, that humanitarian workers are courageous, resourceful, and experienced. but they cannot keep the pace of conflicts constantly growing in numbers and gravity around the world. I speak to you as a sixth night of anguish falls over Europe, struck once again by war, and as millions of innocent Ukrainian civilians huddle in bunkers, scramble to board overcrowded trains, and think with trepidation about the future of their children. Let me say, as an old humanitarian worker myself, that the responsibility that you have to ensure that eventually peace and security for all prevail over power struggles and narrow national interest has never been as urgent and as indispensable a task as it is tonight. If you fail, if we fail, it might be too late for us all. Thank you.
Благодарю господина Гранди за его выступление. Сейчас я предоставляю слово тем членам Совета, которые хотели бы выступить с заявлением. Я предоставляю слово представителю Франции.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie messieurs Griffith et Grandi pour leurs interventions. Les conséquences humanitaires de l'offensive russe en Ukraine sont dramatiques. Le nombre de victimes civiles, y compris des enfants, ne cesse d'augmenter. Des villes sont bombardées. Des infrastructures civiles sont détruites. Environ 500 000 personnes ont été contraintes de fuir et de se réfugier en Pologne, en Hongrie, en Roumanie, en Slovaquie et en Moldavie. Ce chiffre augmente chaque heure. La France salue la solidarité dont les États voisins de l'Ukraine font preuve. La Russie, membre permanent de ce Conseil, viole les principes les plus fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies. Elle piétine le droit international humanitaire, elle bafoue les droits de l'homme, elle piétine les conventions de Genève. La France réitère son appel à une cessation immédiate des hostilités qui doit précéder tout pourparler de paix. La protection des civils, y compris des enfants et des personnels humanitaires, ainsi que des infrastructures civiles, est une priorité absolue. La France ne transigera pas là-dessus. Elle réitère son appel à un accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave à l'ensemble des personnes dans le besoin. Nous avons une responsabilité collective et un devoir moral, celui d'aider la population ukrainienne. La France et ses partenaires de l'Union européenne se tiennent fermement aux côtés de l'Ukraine et de sa population. L'Union européenne a déjà annoncé 90 millions d'euros d'aide humanitaire. La France y prend également sa part. Elle vient d'envoyer 33 tonnes d'aide humanitaire en Pologne pour venir en aide aux Ukrainiens et elle s'apprête à acheminer plus de 30 tonnes d'aide humanitaire en Moldavie. La France salue le lancement, demain, par les Nations Unies, d'un plan de réponse d'urgence pour l'Ukraine et d'un plan pour aider les réfugiés ukrainiens dans la région. Nous appelons l'ensemble des États membres à y contribuer financièrement. La France salue également la nomination par le secrétaire général de M. Armin Awad comme coordinateur des Nations Unies pour la crise en Ukraine. Les sanctions adoptées par l'Union européenne à l'encontre de la Russie et de la Biélorussie seront mises en œuvre dans le plein respect du droit international humanitaire et nous veillerons à ce qu'elle n'ait pas d'impact sur la réponse humanitaire. Monsieur le Président, la France prépare avec le Mexique un projet de résolution du Conseil appelant au plein respect du droit international humanitaire, à la protection des civils et à un accès humanitaire sans entrave afin de répondre aux besoins urgents de la population ukrainienne. Il sera soumis au vote très rapidement. La France salue le courage dont fait preuve le peuple d'Ukraine. Aux Nations Unies et dans toutes les enceintes, elle continuera de se mobiliser avec ses partenaires pour soutenir la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, ainsi que le peuple ukrainien. Je vous remercie.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Мексики.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos al alto comisionado Grandi y al subsecretario Griffiths por sus informes. Las cifras que nos acaban de compartir y el panorama descrito son reflejo de una situación humanitaria que se agrava con el paso de las horas. Es por ello que, entre otras acciones, México y Francia presentarán un proyecto de resolución que busca de manera general el cese de las hostilidades, la protección de los civiles y garantizar el acceso a la ayuda humanitaria. Deploramos que continúen los enfrentamientos en ciudades densamente pobladas como Kharkiv, Odessa, Kiev y otras. Es inaceptable el uso de armas explosivas en zonas pobladas. Señor presidente, es muy preocupante también que amplios sectores de la población no tengan ya electricidad, ni agua, ni acceso a la infraestructura básica. Las comunidades que van quedando aisladas enfrentan escasez de víveres y medicinas. Los servicios de salud deberían preservarse a toda costa. Llamamos a permitir el acceso a todos los trabajadores humanitarios sin restricciones para que puedan prestar sus servicios. Como hemos escuchado, son ya cientos de miles las personas desplazadas, tanto al interior de Ucrania como las que buscan refugio en países vecinos. Si bien se trata aún de cifras muy preliminares, estas ya son alarmantes y van en una escalada acelerada. Tenemos más claridad sobre esta escalada en los próximos días, en las próximas semanas, en los próximos meses y quizá también en los próximos años. Hacemos un llamado a mantener las fronteras abiertas, como ha ocurrido, con gran solidaridad, para que todos aquellos que busquen protección la encuentren y que se respete el principio de non-refoulement. Si bien reconocemos el derecho que asiste a los estados a su legítima defensa, no deja de ser preocupante también el incremento sustancial en el flujo de armas y el impacto que éstas tendrán sobre la población civil. Reconocemos los esfuerzos del secretario general, incluida la creación del Fondo Central para la Acción en Casos de Emergencia, y agradecemos los compromisos económicos que ya han anunciado varios estados. Ucrania requiere hoy de la solidaridad económica internacional para atender las crecientes necesidades de apoyo humanitario. Finalmente, México hace un llamado inequívoco a todas las partes a respetar el derecho internacional humanitario, en particular las 4 convenciones de Ginebra de 1949 y su primer protocolo adicional de 1977, así como el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Gracias, presidente.
Спасибо. Я сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Кении.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Martin Griffiths and High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the distinguished representative of Ukraine. Mr. President, the humanitarian suffering in Ukraine is unnecessary and uncalled for. Kenya offers its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflict in the last few days. We regret the mounting casualties, the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced and those who are exiting Ukraine as refugees, and the growing damage to civilian objects and infrastructure. Mr. President, we commend the UN for swiftly stepping in to provide humanitarian assistance. We also commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees. We give a special thank you to Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia for working with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to enable Kenyan citizens in Ukraine visa-free entry. Mr. President, in the unfolding emergency, there have been disturbing reports about the racist treatment of Africans and people of African descent seeking to flee Ukraine to safety. The media is covering these appalling incidents, and several states have confirmed that their citizens are suffering such treatment. We strongly condemn this racism and believe that it is damaging to the spirit of solidarity that is so urgently needed today. The mistreatment of African peoples on Europe's borders needs to cease immediately, whether to the Africans fleeing Ukraine or to those crossing the Mediterranean. And we also need to be able to understand that there are actors who want to magnify this story for cynical reasons that have nothing to do with the well-being and safety of Africans. Mr. President, we're here to discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. But if we are truly to hold to humanitarian principles, then we must broaden our view. The extensive unilateral economic sanctions that have been announced against the Russian Federation are almost certain to have serious humanitarian consequences. Their effect in total may even amount to a form of blockade. It is our contention that the peaceful means to settle conflicts advocated by the UN Charter do not include acts that may constitute collective punishment. We must also add caution that such considerable sanctions, rather than opening the path to peace, may lead to an escalation and broadening of the conflict. The only way out of this increasingly dangerous crisis is for prioritization of diplomacy to limit all military maneuvers and open the path to negotiation. It is still not too late to turn towards the good offices of the Secretary General, regional organizations, and bilateral efforts to de-escalate this dangerous crisis. Whether the conflict ends now or later with even more disastrous results, it will still require an appetite to negotiate a stable security order. At this moment, statesmanship is required, and we urge all leaders of involved states to embrace their responsibility. As I close, Mr. President, I reiterate Kenya's recognition of the inviolable rights of Ukraine to its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Thank you.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Соединенных Штатов.
Thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi, for your truly sobering briefings. What you've briefed only underscores, I think, what the Secretary General has said, that this is a moment of great peril and great tragedy. Thank you to your agencies, your teams, for answering the call to help Ukrainians in need during this dire hour. In a matter of days, Russia's unprovoked and premeditated invasion has unleashed vast human suffering across Ukraine. We need to address the displacement and refugee crisis that we've just heard described. We need to address the food security crisis, and we need to document and address all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. This council just heard the latest displacement numbers, which have been rising by the hour in the last 4 days. First, it was 50,000 fled, then 150,000 fled, now 500,000 people have fled. This does not even include hundreds of thousands displaced internally within Ukraine. And behind each of these numbers are real people caught in a humanitarian nightmare unfolding before our eyes. And the truth is, no one knows where it will end. How many people will flee their homes? How many will need humanitarian assistance? How many will die? That is because we don't know when President Putin will end his war of choice against Ukraine. I want to thank the many countries and the people in the region who have opened their borders and homes to fleeing Ukrainians. The safety these people are providing underscores our common humanity during an otherwise dark moment of war. And I want to echo the calls of the United Nations Refugee Agency. We should help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees, regardless of race or creed. Of course, not everyone can or will choose to flee, and those who remain in Ukraine must be ensured unobstructed protection and assistance. 4 days into the invasion, our humanitarian partners have already identified cash, fuel constraints, volatile security conditions, and logistical challenges as key operational constraints affecting all aid delivery in the country. We also need to be very concerned by the hunger that Russia's invasion will cause. The World Food Program warns us that the food security impact of Russia's invasion will be felt far beyond Ukraine's borders. The Black Sea Basin is one of the world's most important areas for grain and agricultural exports. Vulnerable people from Asia to Africa and the Middle East will face greater levels of food insecurity as supplies are disrupted, as we are already seeing. An estimated 283 million people in over 80 countries are acutely food insecure or at high risk, and this conflict in Ukraine will only exacerbate situations already on the brink of starvation. This is yet another reason why hostilities must end now. Finally, we are gravely concerned by reports of damage to apartment buildings and schools, as well as significant infrastructure damage that has left hospitals and hundreds of thousands of people without electricity or water, while bridges and roads are damaged by shelling. Adherence to international humanitarian law is critical, including obligations related to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Humanitarian agencies must be granted secure and full access to people in need of aid. Tomorrow, as we've heard, the UN will be launching a funding appeal, an appeal for this humanitarian crisis. For our part, the United States is already providing nearly $54 million in additional humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. USAID has been airlifting and positioning relief supplies, especially needed to help older people, people with disabilities, and people displaced from their homes to face the winter weather. This is just the beginning, and much more is coming. We welcome the commitments and leadership from other nations to ensure life-saving assistance reaches those most in need. No matter what happens next, we must do everything we can to help the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Ирландии. Но объявил только меньше, да, что не выдвинут.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi for their sobering briefings and urgent calls to action today. The Russian Federation's unprovoked and unjustified further invasion of Ukraine continues to visit death and destruction upon the country and its people, inflicting enormous hardship and suffering. Ireland stands in unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They have shown extraordinary courage and resilience. This fresh onslaught comes on the heel of 8 years of conflict in eastern Ukraine, which had already displaced over 1.4 million people who relied on assistance to meet their daily needs. The Russian Federation's invasion has created a humanitarian catastrophe, compounding the suffering of millions with a rapidly rising toll of internally displaced persons and refugees in need of humanitarian assistance. Millions of people in Ukraine are grappling with the humanitarian consequences of a war not of their making. Innocent civilians, including children, are paying the terrible price of conflict. In Kharkiv, Kherson and elsewhere, we have seen significant damage to essential infrastructure. This damage has left hundreds of thousands of people without electricity and water. It has deprived them of vital medical facilities, transportation services, and means of communications. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, the parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to attack only military objectives, the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Ireland is gravely concerned by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which carries a particular risk of causing civilian harm in violation of these fundamental legal obligations. We are particularly concerned by reports of indiscriminate Russian attacks and shelling in Kharkiv, causing death and destruction among the civilian population. The use of prohibited cluster munitions by Russian forces has been reported. If confirmed, this is a further damning indictment of its military aggression. Cluster munitions are by nature indiscriminate, and we condemn all use of these weapons in all circumstances. Ireland urges against attacks on infrastructure and installations, including nuclear power plants. Such attacks would have profound effects on the health of millions and render the surrounding environment uninhabitable for generations to come. Any armed attack on and threat against nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes constitutes a violation of international law, including the principles of the United Nations Charter, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and the IAEA Statute. We also express our great concern at the deployment of weapons and armaments or conducting missile strikes directly from the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Mr. President, the Russian Federation must protect all civilians in Ukraine. We recall its obligations to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. The safety of all humanitarian and medical workers must be ensured. Humanitarians must not be prevented from ensuring principled assistance is delivered where it is most needed and when it is most needed. Ireland and its EU partners are providing significant humanitarian support, and we stand ready to do more. We commend our EU partners and Moldova for their generosity and solidarity in providing shelter to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the war. They are deserving of our support in providing timely humanitarian assistance, especially to the most vulnerable, the elderly, the young, and the sick. We appeal to all countries in the region to keep their borders open to all of those seeking safety and protection. Ireland is already providing humanitarian support, including core funding to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as well as announcing a €10 million humanitarian package in recent days. When conflicts rage, unpredictable, even barely conceivable outcomes can become all too real. Threats to unleash forces that cannot be controlled, including threats of nuclear weapons, are utterly unacceptable. Ireland has long argued that nuclear weapons offer no security. Their use would cause devastation in the region and beyond, bringing a new blight on humanity for generations to come. That is not a prospect that any of us should be willing to contemplate. Mr. President, we urge the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities, unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threats or the use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. In sum, we urge Russia to turn away from war and choose the path of dialogue and diplomacy. This is the right path, and the time to take it is now, before any more lives are ruined or lost. Thank you.
Спасибо. Я предоставляю слово представителю Норвегии.
President, let me thank the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugee, Filippo Grandi, for their frank accounts of the consequences of the Russian invasion for the civilians in Ukraine. We need your strong leadership in the response to this unfolding humanitarian crisis. Norway is stepping up our support to the civilian population in Ukraine. The government has announced it will provide up to $226 million to the humanitarian response. Let me start by underlining that Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis through its unprovoked, unjustified, and irresponsible military aggression. It has blatantly violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The parties to the conflict in Ukraine must comply with their obligation under international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law. They must ensure the protection of the civilian population in all of Ukraine. We demand that all parties ensure the respect for and protection for all medical personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. We are calling on parties to the conflict to protect all humanitarian personnel and ensure and facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid for those in need. The space for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action must be restored and protected. Fighting is going on in and around urban areas with the use of heavy explosive weapons. We are deeply concerned about the long-term harm to the civilians, including children, and civilian infrastructure. Homes, schools, hospitals, water plants, and other civilian infrastructure is being damaged and destroyed. We are deeply concerned about the reported use of cluster munitions. Explosive remnants of war will continue to kill and injure even after the conflict ends, and they will prevent people from returning home, going to school, coming back to work, and rebuilding their communities. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are fleeing the conflict. We commend the neighboring countries for keeping their borders open and for the great generosity and solidarity shown with people fleeing the conflict. The door to safety and protection must remain open to all those in need without discrimination. We will do our part, including providing support. This weekend, 2 media workers were shot and injured. Journalists and media workers are civilians under international humanitarian law. The world relies on independent and truthful reporting of the events that are unfolding. The heroic effort of Ukrainian and international press are incredibly important. We urge all parties to respect and protect the press, both on the ground and online. We demand the unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine to restore the respect of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, and prevent further civilian suffering. Russia started the war in Ukraine. It can choose to stop it now. Thank you.
Спасибо. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Албании.
Thank you, USG Griffiths and UNHCR Grandi, for those startling updates on the catastrophic situation unfolding in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, with its unprovoked aggression, Russia is causing an unprecedented humanitarian situation in Ukraine on a scale that Europe has not seen in decades. We all know the toll of war. In every conflict, it is civilian populations that bear the worst of the consequences, that pay the high price. Conflicts equal with innocent victims, destruction, displacement and refugees, severe human suffering. Those who initiate conflicts do know this. We heard that the situation is alarming. UNHCR Grandi mentioned staggering numbers of hundreds of thousands of people on the move in and out of Ukraine, and all this in a matter of days. Women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities are currently the most in need. As this aggression goes on, civilians everywhere in Ukraine are terrified of what awaits them when the rocket is going to fall on their roof, or what other ways this absurd war will affect them. International law is clear. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure constitutes serious crimes, and perpetrators must be held accountable. There is no justification for this war, as there is no justification when bridges are destroyed, when infrastructure is deliberately targeted, when missiles hit residential areas. Dear colleagues, we're happy to hear that despite hostilities, the UN operation in Ukraine has expanded. We support a strong and reinforced presence of the United Nations and humanitarian partners on the ground. We support the safe, unimpeded access and protection of humanitarian workers and the deliveries to the areas affected by conflict. Our messages are clear. Civilian and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Security and access for humanitarian efforts must be guaranteed. Safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its people is and should remain a priority. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld, in particular the four Geneva Conventions and their first additional protocol. Human rights violations and other crimes must be documented for the purpose of accountability. We commend all countries that are hosting refugees. As already announced last week by Prime Minister Rama, we are happy to shelter Ukrainians forced to flee because of the war. Albania has joined the wide array of sanctions recently adopted by the European Union. The airspace of Albania has been closed to all Russian operators except for flights conducted for emergency and humanitarian needs. We are working to provide assistance in military and hospital supplies to Ukraine. Dear colleagues, the decisions and actions of the coming days will directly affect the lives of millions of people. What is happening in Ukraine should not happen anywhere. We need peace, not war. We need friendship, not aggression. We are and will stand with Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Индии.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UN High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefing. India remains deeply concerned at the unfolding developments in Ukraine, where the situation continues to deteriorate. Our considered call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to all hostilities is an urgent imperative. India's Prime Minister has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We welcome the commencement of direct talks. We reiterate our conviction that differences can only be bridged through sustained dialogue and diplomacy. We also underline that all members have agreed on the principles, the UN Charter, international law, and on the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. In such times of conflict, India attaches the highest priority to the safety and well-being of civilians, in particular women, children, and the elderly. We are of the view that core principles of humanitarian assistance should be fully honored. Taking into account the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines, and these are being dispatched tomorrow. We remain deeply concerned for the safety and security of thousands of Indian citizens, including students, stranded in Ukraine. Our evacuation efforts have been adversely impacted by the developments on the ground at the border crossings. Given that the safety of Indian nationals is of paramount importance to my government, senior ministers from the Government of India are being deployed as special envoys to Ukraine's neighboring countries. We thank them for their cooperation at this difficult time. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. We also support all UN humanitarian efforts. As reiterated yesterday, there is no other option but to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue as the only way ahead. I thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Соединенного Королевства.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I start by thanking our briefers, Filippo Grandi and Martin Griffiths. As a result of President Putin's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a country of 44 million people is now on the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Whatever my Russian colleague claims, the world can see that Russia's indiscriminate attacks against men, women, and children across Ukraine and its disregard for international humanitarian law. Missiles have rained down on Kharkiv, with cluster munitions hitting residential areas and injuring residents. Disruption to supply chains has caused food shortages in Kramatorsk. The reckless bombing of an oil depot in Vasilkiv has unleashed toxic fumes in nearby communities. Violence in Kyiv has forced people to seek refuge underground, with many thousands, including the elderly and disabled, unable to evacuate. And as we've heard from the UN, today hundreds of civilians have been killed as a result of the Russian invasion. My Russian colleague may try to paint the UN's reporting as hysteria, just as they said it was Western hysteria to warn of their impending invasion. But let's look at the facts. 500,000 people have already fled to Poland, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, Slovakia, and other countries. 7 million people have been displaced, and that figure, as the High Commissioner told us, is rising exponentially. UN agencies and humanitarian partners have been forced to suspend operations. In this moment, as the High Commissioner said, of urgent need, the situation that the agencies face is impossible. The UK stands with the Ukrainian people during their time of need. Yesterday, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, announced $54 million in aid to help our Ukrainian friends. This latest assistance package brings the total amount of UK government aid pledged to Ukraine this year to $190 million. Last week, Prime Minister Johnson also announced the UK would guarantee up to $500 million of loans to Ukraine through the multilateral development banks. The UK will also participate in tomorrow's UN appeal. UK government experts have also deployed to the region to provide humanitarian support to those fleeing violence in Ukraine. But colleagues, we know that a humanitarian response is not enough to save the Ukrainian people from the disaster that Russia is inflicting on them. So our message today is simple. Once again, for the sake of humanity, we call on President Putin to stop this war and withdraw his forces from Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Ганы.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank USG Martin Griffiths and High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their very sobering briefings, which unfortunately confirm the images we are seeing on the media. Ghana expresses serious concerns about the unfolding humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The briefings highlight the indiscriminate attacks in civilian populated areas, which have spread fear and panic among the population, who have also been forced into shelters and subways. children, and newborn babies have not been spared of this regrettable situation. Thousands of people have also been internally displaced, including Ghanaians and other nationals, with more than 500,000 people forced to flee to neighboring countries as refugees. Ghana calls for the immediate and unconditional cessation of the hostilities, which have resulted in the current humanitarian crisis, and urges the parties to refrain from further attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. We strongly call on the parties to grant unfettered access to humanitarian agencies and to guarantee their protection and safety. We also call for the safe passage of all civilians caught up in the war and who desire to leave Ukraine. In this regard, Ghana encourages neighboring countries of Ukraine to facilitate the free passage of persons fleeing the war without discrimination and provide them with humanitarian assistance, including medical care, in line with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of peace and seek an early resolution through dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Габона.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le secrétaire général adjoint, Martin Griffiths, et le haut-commissaire Filippo Grandi pour leurs exposés édifiants. Je me félicite de la participation à ce débat du représentant permanent de l'Ukraine. Monsieur le Président, notre message sur la situation qui prévaut en Ukraine est clair. Nous ne voulons pas de guerre contre un État membre des Nations Unies. Notre message contre les conséquences humanitaires de la guerre est tout aussi clair. Mon pays est très préoccupé par les attaques contre des civils et les biens publics civils. Nous appelons les belligérants à s'abstenir de toute utilisation d'armes dont les effets seraient indiscriminés. Nous sommes solidaires des populations qui se trouvent victimes d'une guerre qu'elles n'ont pas choisie, une guerre qu'elles n'ont pas provoquée. Nous demandons en conséquence que l'aide humanitaire soit fournie aux populations qui en ont besoin sans entrave ni discrimination. Nous saluons en cela l'élan de générosité des pays voisins de l'Ukraine dans l'accueil des personnes fuyant la guerre. Monsieur le Président, je tiens à donner écho aux cris d'alarme de ressortissants et étudiants africains, y compris les étudiants de mon pays, qui, fuyant la guerre en Ukraine, se heurtent à des discriminations dans leur exode et leur quête d'abri. De nombreux témoignages parlent d'actes de racisme. Cela est inacceptable. Nous demandons le respect de la dignité et appelons à un traitement équitable de toutes les personnes en détresse. C'est le lieu pour mon pays d'amplifier l'appel de l'Union africaine au respect du droit international qui s'applique en pareilles circonstances et qui prescrit un égal traitement pour toute personne franchissant les frontières internationales dans un conflit. Monsieur le Président, la saignée humanitaire et la détresse des populations ne peuvent s'arrêter que si les hostilités s'arrêtent. C'est pourquoi nous réitérons notre appel à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et à la désescalade. Il faut une réponse humanitaire à la mesure de l'ampleur des besoins en Ukraine et dans les pays voisins. L'appel que le secrétaire général lancera demain pour le financement du plan d'assistance humanitaire est à cet égard d'une grande opportunité. Pour terminer, mon pays exhorte la communauté internationale à faire preuve d'empathie et à soutenir toutes les personnes victimes de la guerre sans discrimination de nationalité ni de race. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов.
سيد الرئيس، أشكر كل من السيد مارتن غريفيث والسيد فيليبو غراندي على مداخلتهما. سيد الرئيس، لقد تدهور الأوضاع الإنسانية في أوكرانيا بشكل كبير في الأيام الأخيرة، حيث يؤدي استمرار القتال إلى أضرار بالبنية التحتية وإصابات وقتلى في صفوف المدنيين. فحسب تقارير الأمم المتحدة يعاني مئات الآلاف من السكان من نقص شديد في الخدمات الأساسية. كذلك فقد تضررت ودمرت العديد من المنازل، وأصبح مئات الآلاف من السكان نازحين أو لاجئين في الدول المجاورة. ومن هذا المنطلق يجب أن يتمكن جميع المدنيين الذين يحاولون الوصول إلى مكان آمن من القيام بذلك دون عوائق، وينبغي أن لا يتعرضوا للتمييز. وجراء الأزمة الأوكرانية نؤكد ضرورة التركيز على الأوضاع الإنسانية المتفاقمة للمدنيين، بما في ذلك عبر العمل على ضمان توفير الحماية لهم والحيلولة دون أن يصل الوضع الإنساني الكارثي لحالة يصعب معالجتها واحتوائها. ومن جانبها تنظر دولة الإمارات في الاحتياجات الإنسانية الأوكرانية الناجمة عن الأزمة من منطلق حرصها الدائم على تخفيف معاناة المدنيين تحت وطأة الصراع. إننا نشجب العنف القائم في أوكرانيا، ونكرر على ضرورة ضبط النفس ووقف إطلاق النار والعمل على حل النزاع بالطرق السلمية، فاستمرار القتال سيؤدي إلى وقوع المزيد من الضحايا الأبرياء وسوء الأوضاع الإنسانية، والتي يزيد من حدتها موسم الشتاء وموجات البرد القاسية في الوقت الذي يبحث فيها المدنيين عن ملاجئ ومناطق آمنة في ظل الأزمة الحالية. كذلك نحث جميع الأطراف على تنفيذ التزاماتها بموجب القانون الدولي، بما في ذلك عبر السماح للمساعدات الإنسانية بالوصول للمحتاجين وعدم استهداف المدنيين. ونشدد مجدداً على ضرورة الالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، لا سيما من حيث احترام سيادة واستقلال الدول ووحدة أراضيها وسلامتها الإقليمية. إن هذه المبادئ التي تأسست عليها الأمم المتحدة تنطبق على جميع الدول الأعضاء باختلاف قدراتها وإمكانياتها وحجمها الجغرافي. وختاماً، تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية العمل على التوصل لوقف إطلاق نار فوري والسعي لإيجاد حلول سلمية بما يخدم الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين والدوليين. وشكراً.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Бразилии.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the briefers for their informative presentations. Let me also take this opportunity to express our solidarity to all families who have lost someone in this war, to all people left without home, water, and electricity, to those who are fleeing in fear, sometimes with nowhere to go, and to everyone who is now trapped in a conflict zone, desperately attempting to find refuge. I wish to commend all personnel that are now in Ukraine trying to alleviate the suffering of the population. We know that you are doing your best in very challenging circumstances, and we know that more could be done to assist you in your efforts. As we speak, hundreds of thousands of civilians have already fled Ukraine. Many more will certainly follow, millions perhaps. Most hostilities are being conducted in densely populated areas where the risks of civilian casualties increase, including children, particularly with the use of explosive weapons. Civilians are being called to join the fighting, possibly with no proper training. There are pressing humanitarian needs for medical services, medicines, health equipment, shelter, and protection. Brazil calls all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law and uphold at all times the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, necessity, and humanity. It is of paramount importance to ensure the protection of civilians and of critical civilian infrastructure, as well as to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need and the protection of refugees and displaced persons. We also reiterate our appeal to Ukraine and Russia to facilitate the withdrawal of all persons who want to leave the Ukrainian territory. Brazil expresses its gratitude to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and others who are facilitating the exit of people fleeing the conflict, including Brazilians and Latin Americans. Mr. President, for international humanitarian law, it does not matter how a war came to existence or who was responsible for it. What matters is to spare civilians and maintain a minimum of humanity in an already inhumane situation. So, beyond any discussion in the Council on the reasons for this war, we can and we must come together to adopt measures to minimize the humanitarian impact of the conflict. This is the minimum that we can do. In moving forward, it's important to closely monitor the situation on the ground, the number of civilian casualties, and the immediate needs of the population. At the same time, there is no doubt that the best way to protect civilians and avoid a humanitarian crisis is to prevent conflict and, when it erupts, to immediately cease it. Any war will generate devastation, death, chaos, and fear. The greater the escalation, the higher the risks of human suffering. In the past few days, permanent members of the Security Council, the ones that bear the greatest responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, have been openly referring to severe unilateral sanctions, military actions, and nuclear forces. This must stop. The world needs these escalations to stop and dialogue to resume. The severe economic sanctions being imposed might have rippling effects in the world's economy, with consequences felt way beyond Russia. Possibly, the population in developing countries will be the ones that will suffer the most. The supply of arms and increasing militarization of the region will hardly promote dialogue. It will probably provoke more tensions. As we have seen reports on nuclear forces being put on high alert, I would like to recall what the International Court of Justice has once said about nuclear weapons. They have the potential to destroy all civilization and the entire ecosystem of the planet. And their threat or use would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict. Any use of nuclear weapons would have unacceptable humanitarian consequences for present and future generations in the territory of Ukraine and beyond. So far, we have received reports of around 200 or 300 of civilian casualties in Ukraine, which is already devastating. If a party resort to a weapon of mass destruction, what will be the number of deaths? What will be the extent of destruction? We have seen that before, and we hope, we plead to everyone involved that we do not see that again. I thank you.
Спасибо. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Китая.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，我感谢联合国副秘书长格里菲斯、联合国难民高专格兰蒂先生所做的通报。当前乌克兰的局势令人痛心，我们呼吁有关各方保持克制，缓和局势，避免平民伤亡。包括外国公民在内，所有平民的生命财产安全和人道主义需求应当得到有效的保障，尤其要防止出现大规模的人道主义危机。我们欢迎联合国秘书长表示，联合国将为协调人道主义援助发挥积极作用。中方认为，联合国和国际社会提供人道援助，应遵守联大第46182号决议确立的人道、中立、公正原则，防止人道行动政治化。主席先生，当前最重要的还是尽快回到外交谈判和政治解决的轨道上来，推动局势降级。中方支持俄罗斯和乌克兰举行直接对话谈判，这是解决问题的根本出路。国际社会应为对话和政治解决创造良好外部条件，避免激化矛盾。安理会的任何行动应有助于发挥建设性作用，而不是使对抗升级。谢谢你，主席先生。
Спасибо. Сейчас я сделаю заявление в своем качестве представителя Российской Федерации. Мы внимательно выслушали доклады Мартина Гриффитса и Филиппа Гранди. Ситуация на Украине, безусловно, вызывает у всех нас самую серьезную озабоченность. Мы видим, что страдают простые люди, которые сегодня фактически оказались заложниками украинских радикалов и националистов, любой ценой цепляющихся за власть. Почему я так говорю? Дело в том, что на территориях, перешедших под контроль вооруженных сил России, население не сталкивается с острыми гуманитарными проблемами. Местные органы власти после ухода радикалов действуют в обычном режиме, оказывая населению все необходимые услуги. Система жизнеобеспечения населения функционирует. Острые проблемы сохраняются лишь в городах, в которых украинской властью был отдан преступный и безответственный приказ о раздаче оружия любому желающему, включая уголовников, специально для этого выпущенных из тюрем. Отсюда массовые случаи грабежей, убийств, мародерства. Информации об этом достаточно в соцсетях. Есть там и обращение ряда глав администраций с призывом к украинским властям остановить это безумие. При этом фиксируем множество случаев, когда впоследствии жертвы вооруженных мародеров и бандитов бессовестно выдаются за якобы погибших от рук неких российских диверсионных групп. Мы обращаемся к киевлянам, которых радикалы удерживают в городе в качестве живого щита. Минобороны России подтверждает, что все находящиеся в Киеве мирные жители могут беспрепятственно покинуть столицу Украины по трассе Киев-Васильков. Данное направление открыто безопасно. Повторяем еще раз, специальная операция вооруженных сил России не ставит своей целью оккупацию Украины или причинение вреда местному населению. Демилитаризация, напичканной натовским оружием страны, направлена на защиту многострадального народа Донбасса и Украины. Проводимая Россией спецоперация не затрагивает объекты критической гражданской инфраструктуры. За 5 дней проведения операции нет ни одного задокументированного случая целенаправленных разрушений, равно как нет и свидетельств гибели мирных граждан по вине российских военных. Нас постоянно заверяют в обратном, ссылаясь на некую достоверную информацию. Хотя сейчас в информационном пространстве огромное количество фейков, с помощью которых на нас хотят возложить ответственность за то, что делает сама Украина. Этот поток грязной лжи, тиражируемый в западных СМИ, к огромному сожалению, стал опасной приметой нашего времени. Вот и сегодня на этом заседании Совета Безопасности мы вновь слышали о бомбардировках жилых кварталов, больниц, школ и детских садов. Зато достоверно известно, что украинские националисты размещают ударные вооружения в жилых кварталах, что составляет прямое нарушение международного гуманитарного права. Мы бы просили Мартина Гриффитса и Филиппа Гранди прокомментировать это. Всем хорошо известно, что начиная с 2014 года Россия, и только Россия, по сути единственная, оказывала поддержку мирному населению Донбасса, столкнувшемуся с непрекращающимися обстрелами со стороны украинской армии и блокадой со стороны Киева. У нас было уже несколько заседаний Совбеза, где мы излагали свои подходы. Не буду повторяться. Отмечу только, что у нас вызывает крайнее сожаление, что даже сегодня при обсуждении гумситуации на Украине никто из западных коллег ни словом не упомянул о жителях Донбасса, страдания которых вы 8 лет предпочитали не замечать. Крайне важной мерой поддержки населения Донбасса стал указ президента России Путина 2019 года об определении в гуманитарных целях категории лиц, имеющих право обратиться с заявлением о приеме в гражданство Российской Федерации в упрощенном порядке. В ситуации, когда жители Юго-Востока Украины были фактически поставлены на грань выживания преступными киевскими властями, организовавшими социально-экономическую блокаду Донбасса, предоставление российского гражданства позволило им получать социальные пособия, пенсии, зарплаты, а также услуги образования и здравоохранения. Сейчас в России находится более 110 тысяч беженцев из Донбасса, вынужденных покинуть места своего проживания после того, как неделю назад Киев предпринял новую попытку добиться решения проблемы Донбасса военным путем, в нарушение Минского комплекса мира. Вина за эту ситуацию лежит и на наших западных партнерах, которые открыто потакали Киеву в отказе от Минска и накачивали его вооружениями. А всего по имеющимся данным, с начала конфликта в 2014 году в Россию выехало около 3 миллионов украинских граждан. В заключение хотел бы еще раз подчеркнуть, что Россия не начала войну, а пытается ее закончить. Украина начала эту войну еще в 2014 году, только вы все эти годы пытались не замечать. Нам было странно слышать от представителей Франции, что европейские санкции в отношении России не нарушают норм международного гуманитарного права и интересов простых граждан России. Мы эти лицемерные заявления слышали и ранее, в контексте других страновых ситуаций. Что касается предлагаемого Францией и Мексикой проекта гуманитарной резолюции по Украине, нам надо внимательно ознакомиться с текстом, прежде чем давать ему какие-либо оценки. В любом случае, просим вас исходить из того, что российские военнослужащие будут оказывать любую необходимую гуманитарную помощь жителям Украины на освобожденных от радикалов территориях. А сейчас я возобновляю свои функции председателя Совета Безопасности и предоставляю слово представителю Украины.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Mr. Under-Secretary General, High Commissioner. First of all, I would like to thank the Security Council for addressing this urgent issue. Every new day of the Russian unprovoked war against Ukraine increases the human sufferings across the entire country. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to the Secretary General for his powerful statement and relentless engagement with the situation in my country. The Ukrainian government welcomes the appointment of Mr. Amin Awad as Assistant Secretary General to serve as UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine, as I know he has arrived to Geneva and resumed his duties. His mission will be extremely difficult against the backdrop of the ongoing Russian military activities that are often equaled to war crimes. At the same time, millions of Ukrainians will require his attention, in particular our children, women, elderly, and other vulnerable citizens. So I wish him and his team strength and mercy in their work. Distinguished members, let us be clear, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis. This war of choice is not only a violation of international code, it violates the conscience of the world. Security assistance is needed, but it alone is not enough. We call on the international organizations to provide us with humanitarian assistance. We call on you to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. Almost all speakers and briefers today were unanimous in their assessments. The situation in Ukraine could deteriorate sharply. Let me provide you with the latest available information from the government of Ukraine. Today is the fifth day of a full-scale, unprovoked and unjustified war launched by Russia against Ukraine. Launched by Russia against the very heart of Europe. Launched by Russia against the idea and ideals of democracy. It is the most horrible and large-scale invasion since World War II. In the morning, I told the General Assembly about the shellings of the residential city of Kharkiv by Russian Grads, killing and wounding dozens of innocent civilians. Now the residents of Kiev, the home of 3 million innocent people, and its suburbs are sitting within Russian crosshairs right now. According to Ukrainian Health Minister Viktor Lyashko, as of today, over 352 people, including 16 children, were killed, and about 2,040 people, including 45 children, wounded. Russia keeps attacking kindergartens and orphanages. Russia is attacking hospitals. Russia is attacking mobile medical aid brigades with shellfire and sabotage groups. Russia fired an ambulance cruise near Zaporizhzhia and Kiev. Let me say that again so that you can see this image in your mind. Russia is attacking hospitals, mobile aid brigades, and ambulances. This is not the action of a state with a legitimate security concern. This is the action of a state determined to kill civilians. There is no debate. These are war crimes. These attacks violate the Rome Statute, and these attacks are far from over. That is why I say this is a humanitarian crisis. As we sit here, Russian missiles are aimed at destroying critical infrastructure, which could lead to a serious environmental disaster and even radioactive contamination. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. None of these facilities are legitimate military targets. The civilian population of Ukraine is the first to suffer from such attacks, and if we do not act today, it will be far from the last. We welcome the statement issued today by the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan on the situation in Ukraine. The statement about his decision to proceed with opening an investigation. In his statement, the ICC prosecutor says that he reviewed the office's conclusions arising from the preliminary examination of the situation in Ukraine and has confirmed that there is a reasonable basis to proceed with opening an investigation. In particular, he is satisfied that there is a reasonable basis to believe that both alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine in relation to the events already assessed during the preliminary examination by the office. Given the expansion of the conflict in recent days, it is his intention that this investigation will also encompass any new alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of his office that are committed by any party to the conflict on any part of the territory of Ukraine. The prosecutor will also be asking for the support of all state parties and the international community as a whole, as his office sets about its investigation. He will be calling for additional budgetary support for voluntary contributions to support all his situations and for the loan of gratis personnel. The importance and urgency of the prosecutor's mission is too serious to be held hostage to lack of means." End of quote. To my colleagues from around the world, this affects you too. Russian military aggression kills not only Ukrainians, but threatens thousands of foreigners who are staying in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is doing its best to facilitate their passage at the state border, even as the border has become overwhelmed with the massive influx of people fleeing Russia's armed aggression. Temporary volunteer assistance points have been set up at the border to provide foreign students with food and cater for other humanitarian needs. Please do not be misled by Russian disinformation. There is no discrimination based on race or nationality, and if there are cases, they should be investigated. Journalists working in the free press also are under fire during live reports from the scenes of action and hot spots. A journalist and a photographer working for the Danish newspaper, Extra Bladet, were injured when their car was targeted in Akhtirka district of Sumy region. Ukrainian children are crossing the EU-Ukraine border without their parents and without powers of attorney from their parents. In this regard, we request decision makers in the EU countries to provide clarifications and instructions to EU institutions in order to secure free movement of and assistance to such underage persons and their guardians. According to the Ministry of Education of Ukraine, more than 350,000 school children have no access to education. Schools are closed due to severe insecurity in civil areas across the country. The numbers of refugees are being assessed. The numbers could be hundreds of thousands of people who have been forced to flee across international borders into neighboring European countries, mostly Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. It can take several days of waiting to cross the border, and we are grateful that more checkpoints on the border with Poland have been opened, including 2 additional pedestrian crossings for all who want to get from Ukraine to the neighboring safe country. Kyiv local authorities have set up a coordinating humanitarian headquarters to provide food and basic necessities to those in need. An electronic platform will be launched tomorrow. On this platform, businesses will be able to provide information about their available resources, and Kyiv residents will be able to announce their needs. All of this information will be systematized for effective communication and distribution of essential goods. Olga Stefanishina, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, who has been appointed as a government coordinator for humanitarian assistance, working 24/7. There are many urgent things to do. like to agree on humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians from the most endangered territories. However, I need to warn you not to be misled by Russian assurances of security. Russian words often, if not always, do not match their deeds. For instance, just recently we heard Russian politicians and diplomats, even here in this chamber, who said that there would be no invasion, no attacks on Ukraine. Hence, these corridors can be easy targets to the Russian army. To help people at the border, crossing points in western regions of Ukraine who are waiting for crossing for at least 1 to 2 days, to provide assistance to IDPs in western regions of Ukraine, including housing, schools, jobs, to provide humanitarian aid to civilians who remain home and now are cut off from markets, including in the occupied territories. Distinguished members of the Security Council, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis, as I said before. The Russian war against Ukraine has brought the entire region to the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Let me therefore repeat our call to the international organizations to provide all possible humanitarian assistance and to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. You have all heard the lies from the Russian side, lies in Moscow, lies in the General Assembly, and lies in the Security Council. Distinguished members of the Security Council and friends around the world, do not listen to Russian lies. Listen to Ukraine's cries. Listen to the cries of men, women, and children who have lived in peace, who deserve to remain in peace, who will forever support your own nation's efforts for peace across Europe and around the world. Russia has tried and failed to defend its lies, but the people of Ukraine, with the help of the world, will never fail to defend our land. Do not listen to Russia's lies. Listen to Ukrainian cries. We need your help. The Russian ambassador laments that a dozen of Russian spies won't be able anymore to enjoy all the benefits of American life while doing things incompatible with their status used as a cover-up. The Russian ambassador should instead work hard to report to his superiors that only his cronies, a bunch of cronies, buy his narrative here in the United Nations. I want to conclude with saying that I'm looking forward to midnight, even though the midnight is the most dangerous time right now because that's when most of the attacks take place. But I'm looking forward to midnight, when this abomination, occupation of the seat of the President of the Council, will be over. I thank you.
А сейчас я хотел предоставить слово Мартину Гриффитсу и Филиппу Гранди и попросить их ответить на вопрос, который мы задали в ходе нашего выступления, как размещение тяжелых вооружений в жилых кварталах украинских городов соотносится с международным гуманитарным правом.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me respond to that, if I may, or try to. I can say that we have no confirmation of such reports of radicals placing such weaponry in residential areas. The fact is that accountability at this stage for breaches of international humanitarian law, which we must see in time, is naturally at this level of the conflict and this level of the violence, at this level of the uncertainty, very difficult to establish. We are truly in a period of a fog of war, a fog which obscures the futures of so many people of Ukraine. I made a number of points, I would add, in my remarks, in my briefing, about our fears of the impact on civilian objects, civilian infrastructure, as a result of urban warfare. I mentioned, for example, Mr. President, our reminder that large-scale urban warfare also requires the need to avoid the wide-area explosive weapons. We are very, very concerned at what we're seeing now in the streets of some of the key large modern cities of Ukraine, the way in which people are voting with their feet, the way in which basic services are being interrupted, and the way in which civilian infrastructure is being damaged. And we will, in time, I am quite sure, discover who did what and who broke which requirements of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Хотел узнать, Филиппо Гранди, вы хотите сказать несколько слов?
No, thank you, Mr. President. I fully support what the Undersecretary General just said. Thank you.
Список ораторов исчерпан. Прежде чем я закрою заседание, я хочу сказать, что, слушая комментарии наших сегодняшних докладчиков, я был удивлен, потому что одни доклады и видеоролики, и сообщения о том, что происходит на Украине, принимаются за данность, а другие, которые очевидны и которые выложены в интернете, достоверность которых не подлежит сомнению, считаются не то что недостоверными, они считаются, что они не прошли подтверждения и проверки. Но мы пришлем вам видеоролики с этими записями. Будем рассчитывать, что руководство ООН даст комментарии по поводу того, чем считать подобные действия украинских радикалов. Как я сказал, список ораторов исчерпан. Поскольку это последнее запланированное заседание Совета в феврале, прежде чем объявить его закрытым, от имени делегации Российской Федерации я хотел бы выразить искреннюю признательность секретариату Совета за всю поддержку, которую они нам оказали. Это был действительно насыщенный месяц, в котором нам удалось прийти к консенсусу по ряду важных вопросов, входящих в нашу компетенцию. Правда, как вы все знаете, не по всем. Я хотел бы еще раз поблагодарить всех представителей секретариата, включая сотрудников по конференционному обслуживанию, устных и письменных переводчиков, составителей стенографических отчетов и сотрудников безопасности. Наше председательство заканчивается, и я уверен, что в этом меня поддержат члены Совета, пожелать делегации Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов удачи в марте. Заседание закрывается.
We are working very close with France, and we hope that the consultations about the text will continue. There is no rush for it because it's a serious document.
Mr. Ambassador, when are you expecting votes on first the General Assembly resolution and then the humanitarian resolution?
No, we will follow the procedures, and they are very clear. There are procedures to follow on when the vote may take place after you upload a draft.
Do you have a comment, Ambassador, on the ICC prosecutor wanting to open an investigation?
I made a statement in the Security Council referring to the press statement by the prosecutor, so you can go in record and check my statement online. We welcome the statement that he made. We also would like to, as he does in his statement, we also invite all the parties to provide him with necessary logistic and financial assistance in performing his duties and investigation.
Excuse me, when you say there is no rush of the resolution, it's for the French resolution on humanitarian?
When I say rush, I mean that we should not really act frantically. We should act according to the procedures and fully informed about what is going on around us.
Mr. Ambassador, what's your next step at the United Nations? What is Ukraine going to be doing?
We'll continue to consolidate the very clear position of the healthy majority of this organization in defense of the Charter and saving this organization for the future generations.
Can you tell us a bit more about the text messages you read at the General Assembly? How did you obtain them?
What text?
The screenshots.
Oh, you can go to the authorities of Ukraine and you ask them. They are verified by the authorities.
Ambassador, what did you find out from the talk, from the peace talk, from your government? What's really happening?
No, I have no comments because they will continue tomorrow. Too early to comment. Too early to comment. I have no readout for security reasons. All right?
Thank you, Mr.
So see you soon.
Do you expect your foreign minister